All right, today we're going to cover the Middle and New Kingdom of Egypt. So this is our second day of Egypt notes, but our third day overall for River Valley civilizations. And as we go through all these notes for these different River Valley civilizations, we should be looking at similarities and differences between them. And a little hint, if you're able to do that, if you can compare and contrast their similarities and differences, then you might just be ready for the essay that will be on the River Valleys test coming up in a couple weeks. When we last left the Old Kingdom, politically, the Egyptians were in turmoil, and we end up seeing a division and a weakening of a central authority in Egypt. And we have a division between Upper and Lower Egypt, much like we had before the time of Narmer. And this was considered like the Dark Ages for Egypt. So sometime around 2080 BCE, we see the return of strong pharaohs who take control of the Egyptian government. And once again, we have a strong central authority. These pharaohs will move the capital of Egypt to Thebes, which was located in Upper Egypt. During the Middle Kingdom, the pharaohs organized drainage projects. They would drain the water out of marshy lands, leaving them with suitable land for farming. We call land that is good for farming arable land. Arable is a vocab word you need to know. I would circle it. Arable means farmable. So the Egyptians are able to grow more food now. The Egyptian army will move south into a kingdom called Nubia. And the Nubians had access to a lot of gold, so the Egyptians conquered them and used their gold for their own means. Egyptian traders during this time had more contact with the Middle East, as well as the Mediterranean island of Crete. So we see more cultural diffusion, more interactions between these different groups of people who operate in North Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East. Around 1640 BCE, the Hyksos will invade Egypt and they will conquer Egypt's delta region. So we see the Middle Kingdom fall into a decline. The Hyksos were from the Middle East, near the Mediterranean coast, and with them they brought a secret weapon, the horse-drawn war chariot. So imagine you're lined up, you're on foot, and as the battle begins, all of these horses with guys being pulled in the back with bow and arrow or swords are coming at you. You're probably going to try to run away. And that's when bad things can happen to your army. As you're running away, you can't defend yourself and you get cut down. Not only that, the Hyksos have bronze weapons, while the Egyptians are still fighting with copper. And the bronze weapons are able to break these bronze weapons upon impact. They're also sharper. They're going to be stronger. It's going to be a big benefit to the Hyksos to have these weapons. So the Hyksos are able to dominate Egypt, but they're so impressed with Egyptian culture that they're going to adopt many of the Egyptian customs for themselves. And we're going to see other groups do the same. They will rule Egypt for around 70 years. And we're going to see Egypt get conquered over and over again. And one of the reasons that this happens is because Egypt was known as the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. You could grow so much food on the banks of the Nile, other groups wanted it so they could feed their own populations. It wasn't long before Egypt wanted to make a comeback. They didn't want to be ruled by outsiders. So several rulers from southern Egypt helped to get rid of the Hyksos. The first was Queen Ahotep, who takes over when her husband was killed in battle. And if we look at this mummy, we believe that this is her husband, and we can see the wound above his eye that we think killed him. Also notice that Ahotep is depicted with something on her chin. What is that we're looking at? So she's wearing a beard. She didn't grow it herself, But like we talked about back with Sargon, if you're going to be a leader, great leaders have great beards. So she wore this fake beard in ceremony and was depicted as having a beard even though she was a female. We think she continued to rule as queen, but one of her sons, the pharaoh Kamos, would eventually take power. And even though he only reigned for 3 to 5 years, he was able to finally get rid of the Hyksos. And their successes would eventually bring us into the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom was seen as a new golden age for Egypt. It was a glorious time for the Egyptians. Once again, we had strong pharaohs who had absolute authority over all of Egypt. We will see the Egyptians build an empire, meaning they went out and conquered new lands. They built an impressive army, and they used some of the ideas that the Hyksos had used against them. They used chariots, but they also used foot soldiers, now using bronze weapons. They also had archers. So this was a great time to be an Egyptian. Egypt was rich and growing strong. In 1472 BCE, we get the reign of Hatshepsut. And she was meant to rule as queen while her young stepson grew older. And that stepson was Thutmose III. But it wasn't good enough for her to be just a queen. She actually becomes pharaoh. So that means that she is indeed now considered a god walking on earth. Unlike other New Kingdom pharaohs, she encouraged trade. She didn't want to just wage war and take from others. She was known for building monuments, including obelisks. What is an obelisk? Or what's an example of an obelisk? There's actually one in DC that you guys have all seen before. So the one we're probably thinking of is the Washington Monument. The obelisks that the Egyptians built were not that tall, but it was the same general idea. We do think that she was eventually killed by her stepson. Now, her stepson Thutmose III didn't do it on his own. He probably had people kill her, but she was in the way to him taking power as a pharaoh himself. And if you notice, Hatshepsut also wearing a beard. Beards show that you have power in the ancient world. So here we have the examples of obelisks. This would be one piece of stone that was carved and set up. And if you notice, it has hieroglyphics on it. You as the pharaoh would have inscriptions of all the great deeds that you had done on them, so everyone knew how powerful you actually were. So that brings us to Pharaoh Thutmose III. He takes over for his stepmother. And unlike her, he is a warlike ruler. He wants to invade other nations and conquer them. He will invade what is today Palestine and Syria near the Mediterranean, and he will also go south towards Nubia and conquer that as well. And with these conquests, he brings wealth and new ideas to Egypt. Whenever we get new ideas from other peoples, we call it cultural diffusion, our two favorite words in World History 1. Here we have some artwork depicting his conquests, and compared to artwork today, probably not very good. It's two-dimensional. They hadn't figured out how to create a background. If you look at the horses, it's tough to see, but there's actually like a bunch of feet here. It's supposed to represent multiple horses, but they're just not very good at artists. And of course, who are these guys down here? Again, not very good with perspective, so these tiny people were meant to represent his enemies that he is crushing. He also tries to erase his stepmother, Hatshepsut, from the records. He destroyed a lot of her obelisks. Enough remained so that we could figure out that there was a Hatshepsut and piece together what had happened. Okay, but under Thutmose, we have a strong Egyptian empire. And here is the Tutmos mummy, smiling for you guys. Our next pharaoh is Ramses II, also known as Ramses the Great. He's known as the first leader to use diplomacy in a confrontation. And diplomacy is when both sides come together and make an agreement. He's going to go to war with the Hittites, a group who lived in Anatolia. And they were fighting over Syria. And the two sides met at the Battle of Kadesh. And they battled it out. And neither side was able to claim victory. So Ramses and the Egyptians met with the Hittite leadership and they came to a peace agreement. They divided the land. Everything north of Kadesh went to the Hittites. Everything south went to the Egyptians. And they said they would be brothers forever. He would rule for 67 years and he lived to the age of 99. So he had the best medical care available in the ancient world to live that long. People typically did not live that long, not even close. And of course, you guys are all wondering about his 200 wives. He did have a lot of children. He had about 100 children, around 50 sons, around 50 daughters. We don't know conclusively how many children he had. And he actually outlived many of these wives and some of his children as well. It was actually his 13th son who would take over as the next pharaoh for him. Ramses was known as one of the great builder pharaohs, building monuments and temples across his empire. And we think he might have been the pharaoh at the time of Moses. We will get to Moses and the exodus or exit of the Jews out of Egypt in a later unit. But you may have been familiar with the biblical story or have watched The Prince of Egypt, the animated movie, and know what we're talking about. Here is his temple that he had built at Abu Simbel, and we see 3 statues out front that we still have. And of course, these 3 statues are of himself. It's Ramses, because when you're the great pharaoh, you build statues to yourself. And of course, the 4th one, which has been destroyed, we can probably guess that was Ramses as well. So we've got Ramses depicted at the temple on the left, and using his mummy, this is what scientists think that he looked like based on renderings. And we think that he actually had red hair before it all turned white. We think that Ramses ends up dying due to an infection when his teeth were deteriorating. And in his place are weak, self-absorbed leaders who aren't fit to guide Egypt. And what makes matters worse is beginning in 945 BCE, Egypt is invaded and taken over by many different groups. Like we talked about earlier, these outsiders wanted access to the Nile River so they could grow crops for their own people. And these groups included the Libyans, the Nubians, the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. We'll talk about a few later, like the Greeks and Romans. So for the longest time, Egypt had been isolated, especially in the Old Kingdom. They had natural barriers that surrounded them, the Mediterranean to the north, the desert to the east and west, and the cataracts to the south. But over time, people found their way around these natural barriers. One of the groups to do so were the Libyans, who were able to cross the Sahara Desert. They would conquer and rule Egypt for around 200 years. Like the Hyksos, who had conquered Egypt centuries before, they would follow the Egyptian way of life. People liked the culture of Egypt. The Libyans would eventually be thrown out of Egypt by an outside group called the Nubians. Pianki was a Nubian king, and his army would drive the Libyans out in 751 BCE. But then the Nubians would control Egypt. So those natural barriers that had protected Egypt aren't doing such a good job anymore. We have new technology. Here we see the Libyans crossing the desert and they are riding on camels. Anytime you can get a camel picture into the PowerPoint, we're doing a pretty good job. So if we follow the Nile River south, even further south than Upper Egypt, we run into the land called Nubia. And Kush was a kingdom that grew from Nubia. Your book calls this area Kush. For us in our class and on the SOL, we'll refer to it as Nubia. Nubia was an important trade link between sub-Saharan Africa, meaning everything south of the Sahara Desert, and the rest of the world. As those goods would come north using the Nile River, they could be traded to the rest of the Mediterranean world. So Nubia would be a rich and powerful African kingdom. They were known for their gold, ivory. What animal does ivory come from? And if you answered elephants in the chat, you would be right. Copper, they had frankincense, which you would use like potpourri. It gives off a fragrance. And ebony, which was a dark wood that people like to use to carve with. So as Egypt declines, Nubia becomes a regional power. And they kind of take the place of Egypt. Like other groups, the Nubians took ideas from the Egyptians, including these pyramid tombs. Of course, these are not on the grand scale of the pyramids at Giza, but these Nubian pyramids were inspired by the Egyptians, only much smaller. Egypt had a huge influence on Nubia. Nubian princes would be sent to Egypt to learn the Egyptian language, customs, and religion. The Egyptians inspired Nubian temples, their smaller pyramids, statues, and the Nubians would use a form of hieroglyphic writing based on the Egyptian hieroglyphics. So while Egypt declines, the Nubians see themselves as the keeper of Egyptian values and culture. They had removed the Libyans, kicked them out of Egypt, but then they took over as rulers of Egypt themselves. We will see Pianki, the Nubian king who took over Egypt, on our test. Everyone always forgets about him, and a lot of students miss that question. Don't forget Pianki. I would put a star next to his name. He conquers the Libyans in 751 BCE and drives them out of Egypt. And then he begins Egypt's 25th dynasty with his family in charge. And the Nubians will stick around in Egypt for quite some time, almost 100 years, until the Assyrians come in and conquer the Nubians in 671 BCE. Again, we see a lot of dates. We're not going to need to know these dates. And the Assyrians are a group we'll talk about in a few units. They're kind of the bad boys of the Middle East and disrupt life for a lot of different people. If you notice, Pianki is wearing the Egyptian-style crown and has the cobra right over his forehead. The capital city of Nubia was Meroe. The Nubians would eventually be pushed south by the Assyrians, and they would settle near the Red Sea with Meroe as their capital. They would trade with the interior of Africa, along with Arabia and India. And they would be able to live well and prosper until around 350 CE, when they would be conquered by Axum, another group we'll talk about later on. So today's Day of Notes, yeah, we covered Egypt, but it's also a lot of to be continued with these other groups that we'll talk about later in the year. So that's it. We are finished with notes and we are done with Egypt for the time being.